Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malde, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, I interviewed the Director of BPC's Congress Project, John Richter, and BPC Senior Advisor, Theresa Cardinal Brown, about a recent bipartisan visit to the southern border. The visit, arranged as part of BPC's American Congressional Exchange Program, brought 6 members of Congress to the border to better understand the urgent challenges and opportunities for bipartisan cooperation on US immigration and border policy. Theresa then chats with one of the members, Representative Nikki Budzinski, about her thoughts on the trip and what she learned from it. Stay tuned to hear more. About 5 years ago, the Bipartisan Policy Center started the American Congressional Exchange, or ACE program. The ACE program brings 2 members of Congress together, one Democrat and one Republican, to visit each other's districts to learn more about each other and the policy issues their districts face. By facilitating the members to engage one-on-one with each other and understand what motivates and concerns them, ACE hopes to build trust and spur the crafting of impactful bipartisan solutions. Today, we are pleased to have one of the founders of the program, John Richter, the director of BPC's Congress Project. John has more than 23 years of experience in the legislative arena, having worked for former Senator Olympia Snowe, serving in numerous capacities in her office, including as speechwriter, deputy legislative director, and for nearly 10 years as chief of staff until her departure from the Senate in 2013. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Good to be here, Jack. Thank you for having me.
And we are also joined once again by BPC Senior Advisor for Immigration and Border Policy, Theresa Cardinal Brown, who helped John and his team put the trip together and served as a moderator and subject matter expert for the members on the trip. So welcome, Theresa.
Hi, Jack.
So, John, we'll start with you. Could you tell us a bit more about how the ACE program started and why you started the initiative?
Sure. And I'll actually jump back about 10 years ago when the Bipartisan Policy Center had something called its Commission on Political Reform. And it was a very comprehensive and deep dive into making recommendations to improve both our electoral system and also some of the systems and norms within Congress. And one of the major themes that emerged on the Congress side was that members of Congress just don't get a chance to get to know each other as people as much anymore in these current times. There was a time, many years ago now, really, but when members of Congress and senators would actually move their families to Washington. They would stay here on weekends. They would not go home as frequently. And so they actually got to know each other better. They would socialize. They would see each other at their, children's, sporting events and things like that. And so they developed, some personal bonds that don't really exist as much today. And that's not to say there was some golden age of, bipartisanship and everyone getting along. But, I think we can all imagine from our own lives that it's much less easy to demonize someone that you've got to know on a personal level. So in around 2017, my co-director for the ACE program, Jonathan Perman, actually came to us with this idea. He had kind of shopped it around a little bit with some members of Congress and put together some ideas about how it might work. And it was to have members of Congress, as you mentioned, Jack, visit each other in each other's districts for a day or so, a Democrat and a Republican. And, again, it's really on the notion that relationships matter. We know that from our own lives. And certainly it is a predicate to the legislative process. So what happens on these trips is that they get to meet with local and regional leaders and decision makers, in areas like education, healthcare, workforce development, government. They tour sites and places of local and regional importance. And really, so one of our participants summed it up best when he once said that if you want to really see where someone's coming from, you ought to actually see where they're coming from. And so the ACE program provides an opportunity for them to do a little bit of that. And I would just say parenthetically, we've done over 50 of these trips now, and we weren't sure who exactly would want to participate in these when we first formed the program, thinking maybe it's just going to be sort of the quote unquote usual suspects, moderates from either party. And it's actually proven to be at least 2/3 of our participants who are not folks you would consider in the political middle. And we think that's important. And finally, I would just say that the ultimate goal is when they come back to DC, they now try to work on things together. And we always, kind of joke, they're not going to be solving, the Social Security solvency crisis or, major top line issues, but there are many issues in Congress that are sort of below those where there is a potential for bipartisanship. And so those are the kinds of places that we're trying to get these folks to come together a little bit.
So, John, what would you say are some of the key achievements of the program so far?
So again, looking at issues where these members of Congress can, make a difference for their constituencies, and in particular areas where there could be bipartisanship. For instance, the very first pairing that we had, Representatives Jack Bergman and Stephanie Murphy, came back and they worked on legislation together that was eventually adopted as part of the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, to help returning U.S. service members get back into civilian employment a little bit more easily. And they said on the floor, but for the program, that would not have happened. We had another instance where we had a member of Congress who was on a particular committee and went on a couple of these trips with another person from that committee. And as a result, about a dozen of their mental health and addiction-related measures passed through the committee and passed into law. And he credits the relationship built during the trips for that. And then just very recently, earlier this year, we had two members of Congress, one from Northern California, one from Hawaii, who came together really predicated on the fact that the California member had the city of Paradise, California, that had the terrible wildfires 5 or 6 years ago, and then of course Lahaina in Hawaii on the island of Maui, suffering terribly last year from fires, and so they were able to share experiences. The member from Hawaii was able to really gain a lot of knowledge from visiting the Northern California district as to what kinds of things have worked and haven't worked in terms of recovery. And then they immediately went to Hawaii together and transferred a lot of that knowledge to folks on the ground in Maui. So it's that kind of thing that I think really sort of encapsulates what we're trying to drive at with the program.
That's great. And obviously, this trip was about the border. So, Theresa, we know the border is an important but pretty polarizing topic, and we rarely see effective collaboration between Republicans and Democrats. So, what were you hoping to achieve with this trip?
So I think, many of us have seen reports of members of Congress who go to the border, and usually it's a group of Republicans that go to the border and they, have a big press conference in front of a border wall and meet with Border Patrol. And then they, talk about the things that they already were doing as Republicans on the border. And Democrats might go and meet with folks at an immigrant shelter and talk about, how the poor migrants need to come in. And then they do their press conference and kind of already decided what it is they want to do at the border. What we were hoping to do was really kind of get Republicans and Democrats together and give them what I called a full 360 view. So, we met with. Yes, they went and toured the border with the Border Patrol, but they also went to the ports of entry to see how the Customs and Border Protection field officers at the border have to manage the regular daily flow of trade and commerce and travelers. We had them tour a migrant shelter. We had them meet with law enforcement and leaders of rural communities that are impacted by the migrants that are trying to evade detection and the drug issues. We had them meet with academics and lawyers about the process. We had them meet with officials in the city and businesses who are interested in, in the workforce aspects of immigration. And then we, managed to get them to actually go across the border into Nogales, Mexico, and see it from the other side. So that was really our goal, was to try to break them out of what may be somewhat of a political bubbles that the Democrats and Republicans kind of can fall into on these trips, and view these things together and see, as I said, all of the different aspects of the issue.
Great. And the design of this trip was a little bit different to previous ACE trips. So we had 6 members of Congress, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and they didn't visit each other's districts. They all went together to the border. But John, I'd be interested to know a bit more about how did we select these participants, and can you tell us a little bit more about them?
Sure. So, as you alluded to, for all the trips we've done previously, the premise was a little bit different. It was to try to get each of the members from the opposite parties to kind of understand where the other one was coming from, like why they make the speeches that they do, why they vote on the floors they do, and understand their motivations, what kind of pressures and things they face from their constituencies. And again, just sort of build up a little bit of that, mutual understanding where they come back. They don't necessarily agree with each other on everything now, but they get each other. This, of course, was focused on more of a singular issue. And we first and foremost wanted this to be substance, not theater. And so, first of all, we were looking at the Arizona border. So we had a Republican and a Democrat from Arizona who were, ostensibly spearheading and leading the trip. But then in terms of the other folks, a couple of different characteristics. First of all of the folks who came on the trip were members of either the New Democrat Coalition, which describes itself as a pragmatic House Democrats who work across the aisle on forward-looking policies, or members of the Republican Governance Group, which is kind of nicknamed RG2. And they describe themselves as members who advocate for common sense legislation on issues. So it made sense to invite those members. And also, frankly, they were all newer members who haven't so much been entrenched in some of the Washington hyper-partisanship and, are interested in getting things done. Even though they're, staunch Democrats or Republicans, they came here to D.C. to produce results. And so those are the kind of people we were looking for. Again, we didn't want this to, this wasn't a show that we were putting on. This is something that was designed to provide information to serious lawmakers and hopefully provide a foundation for some sort of future action.
I think we should probably just go ahead and name the members who were on the trip, just so that our listeners have it. So the 2 Arizona members were Representative Juan Ciscomani and Representative Greg Stanton. And then we had Representative Nikki Budzinski of Illinois, Representative Young Kim of California, Representative Eric Sorensen of Illinois, and Representative Nick LaLota from New York. Those were the participants in the trip.
That's great. And Theresa, the members did quite a lot of stuff. They visited different facilities, professional groups, including business and industry leaders, advocacy groups, academics from the ASU School of Transborder Studies, and CBP and ICE officials. So, pretty jam packed itinerary. Can you give us a rundown of what you guys got up to and how you developed the itinerary?
Sure. So John Richter and his co-leader of the ACE program, Jonathan Perman, reached out to me for help in sort of designing an itinerary that would, as I said, sort of cover the 360-degree view of the border. We also wanted to we started in Phoenix, where most of the members flew into, and then proceeded down to Tucson, and then sort of during the course of the trip went closer to the border and then back. And we thought that was important because the border doesn't just affect the border. It does affect cities near the border. Both Phoenix and Tucson are major transportation hubs. So people who do cross the border and are trying to get other places in the country often go through there. But they also have slightly different views on the border. So we visited in Phoenix and with academics who run the School of Transborder Studies and different business leaders, local government leaders, folks from the governor's office who deal with business and development issues and how they see immigration, not just about, the border, but overall, what part do immigrants play in the economies of the city like Phoenix and the things they're trying to do. One of the things that was interesting is that we had representatives from a couple of the companies that are building very large chip fabrication plants in and around the Phoenix and Tucson areas under the Chips and Science Act, who were talking about, hey, we need to look at our legal immigration system because one of the challenges we're having, even though these areas have great people, but they don't have enough great people to staff and build our facilities. And so we need to look at this from a workforce position. So I think that, that was sort of step one. Step two, as we got closer to Tucson, then we wanted to talk to people who understand the law and the process, right? Many of the members don't have a deep understanding of immigration. We've talked a lot on this podcast about immigration is very, very complex. And certainly how it actually happens, the process that it undertakes is something that can be misunderstood or not clearly understood by members. So we wanted to give them a good briefing on what does the law actually say and what is the process that migrants go through when they are encountered at the border from some lawyers, including people who've tried to help them through the asylum process. What are the challenges involved? So we were able to hear from folks at University of Arizona Law School on that. And then we went, further down the border and we met with state and local officials, mainly local officials, including law enforcement, sheriffs, local prosecutors, mayors of towns in much more of the rural areas of Arizona down near the border, talking about the impact on their communities of just this large amount of immigration that is happening at the border. We heard stories of, car chases by law enforcement and smugglers that ended in tragedies at the border that local officials then have to deal with. We heard stories of the drug trade that is infecting these communities as well as communities across the country. That is also something that we have to pay attention to at the border. And the challenges of them trying to work with the federal officers and agents on the border and how well that's working. So we heard a lot of that. And then going down to the border, the members got to go on a ride along with Border Patrol. And as I mentioned, tour the port of entry facilities to learn about trade and travel and how they try to balance these things. And last but not least, we were able to work with the State Department to cross into Mexico to meet with the U.S. Consul General there in Nogales. And they toured Maquia, which is a U.S. company that operates a manufacturing facility right on the Mexican side of the border. It employs a lot of local Mexican nationals, but also is an important stepping stone for the manufacturing and supply chain process for companies in the United States. So we got to see a lot of different things in a lot of places that as I said, hopefully to give a broader perspective than the border is all just about, thousands of people arriving and claiming asylum, right? There's lots of different aspects and lots of different perspectives that all deserve to be heard in this.
So, Theresa, do you have a particular highlight from the trip?
I think one of the highlights was the meeting that we had with the local mayors and law enforcement officers and agents from the more rural part of Southern Arizona and just listening to their stories. I think sometimes in the Washington, D.C. dynamic, when we hear people talking, it's at a political level and we're all sort of assuming different things about different perspectives and what people may believe. But the truth is that they're trying to manage a situation that is really difficult for them to manage with the resources they have. And they're looking for help. They're looking for partnerships with the federal government, and they're having trouble getting that. And I think just hearing that firsthand from people that might, you might otherwise sort of ascribe a particular positioning to, I think the other thing that was a little bit of a fun jaunt is, when we crossed into Nogales and then we did our visits there, we were coming back across, we walked across the border in Nogales, and on the Mexican side of the border, there's a big market there with lots of vendors selling lots of stuff. And there was a member who said, I'm not leaving Mexico without getting a street taco. And suddenly all the members had to go get a street taco. And so we all had to stop and pause so that they could get a street taco, and spent, that time over this little thing of getting a Mexican taco and drinking the Mexican Coke before we went back across to the US side. And, it's those kind of spontaneous things that make our trip planners crazy. We were all there like, we're on have a schedule to keep, but for the members, it's a kind of bonding experience. Like they get to do something together that's a little bit fun on this otherwise, information packed trip.
Yeah, I would just briefly echo what Theresa said. Both of the things she mentioned really, I think, sort of epitomize what we're trying to do with this program. The meeting with the local officials and the law enforcement folks near the border, that was something where I think it demonstrated two things. First of all, when you get members of Congress outside of Washington from both parties, you get them together away from the crucible here. You see, and it wouldn't be true with all of them, but with more of them than you would imagine, you see them becoming less, political animals and more listeners, more respectful, more willing to, engage in, frankly, productive conversations. And then at the same time, we saw some of the folks on the ground there who are legitimately, concerned about what's going on there, angry in some respects, and with some legitimacy. But I think for them to see that this wasn't a show that was being put on, but was an actual exchange of ideas, kind of led them to, strongly express what was on their minds, but in a respectful way. And again, really, that's kind of what we're driving at, is we're trying to take the temperature down a little bit and allow for room for people to listen to each other and hopefully try to work together.
Yeah, that was one of the other things we really wanted to make sure we did as we were putting together the trip. All of the meetings were conducted under Chatham House rules, which meant, we're not going to publicize who's there and who's saying what. We wanted everybody to be able to speak freely, the members and the people they were meeting with. So this wasn't for public consumption, right? This wasn't for a media hit. People weren't tweeting from the room or, Xing or whatever it's called now, but we wanted to make sure that people felt safe and comfortable to really express themselves. And as John said, for the members, it's a little bit of a relief not to have to be in front of a camera and be there for show and go off talking points. They had a chance to really ask in-depth questions and receive in-depth answers that, I kind of wish maybe more of our congressional hearings were like that than sort of a lot of let's pound the witnesses. But it did make for respectful exchange of ideas, even when there were some obvious, maybe different viewpoints and some disagreements, but everybody was willing to open up and listen and engage. And I think that was part of the other way that we set up the meetings to be able to do that.
The only other thing I would add too is I sort of, if enjoyed is the right word, but was interested to see the reaction of, several members who had been on other trips to the border, but not the Arizona border, and for them to really be struck by how different parts of the border can be and how diverse the challenges are. Theresa, I know, as you like to say, you've seen 1 mile of the border between Mexico and the U.S. You've seen 1 mile of the border between Mexico and the U.S. And they really picked up on that during the trip.
Great. Well, Theresa, the trip happened before Biden's latest executive order on the border. After having gone on the trip and seen the situation on the ground, what impact do you expect this executive order to have? And for the listeners that don't know, do you mind just giving a quick rundown of what that executive order did?
Sure. So last week, the week before we're recording this, President Biden issued an executive order, and there was an accompanying regulation from the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice implementing some changes to how asylum seekers at the border are going to be processed. The the key part of the executive order and the regulation is something very similar to what we saw in the bipartisan border bill that was being considered in the Senate. And that is basically when encounters at the border reach a certain threshold, basically we will severely limit the ability of people to ask for asylum, and people will be formally deported much more quickly until we see the encounter levels go back down. The levels in the executive order were set at an average of 2,500 encounters across the border in a previous 7-day period. And since we were already far above that, the order kicked in immediately. And what it does is basically saying after the threshold is hit, anyone who comes between ports of entry and asks to apply for asylum will not be able to seek asylum. There are some exceptions with a higher bar for people to make sure that we don't send somebody back to persecution or torture. But in general, there won't be the ability to actually just say, okay, we're going to put you in a process to ask for asylum. They will be deported if possible. And the if possible is a real important thing here because if they're not from Mexico or from Central America or from one of a handful of other countries that Mexico will take back, it requires time, resources, facilities, airplanes, people, and the agreement of another government to take back people when we deport them, all of which are in limited supply right now. So absent additional resources at the border, to answer sort of the first part of your question, will it have an impact? This is where one part of the border, what part of the border you're at matters. And who is coming to that part of the border. So, for example, right now, at least when we were in Arizona, a lot of the people arriving in Arizona were Mexican, so they could be sent back to Mexico rather quickly or from Central America. But if you go a little further west in San Diego, they're seeing a lot of people from a lot of places outside the hemisphere, like China and India, or even Africa and Asia countries like, Uzbekistan. Those are not places that we can regularly send people back to, although we try to. And so they may not be able to be quickly deported. And if they can't be quickly deported, chances are they will be released. So the impact of this will probably depend on what nationalities are arriving at which sectors and what capacities those sectors have for holding people in custody and removing them relatively quickly. That resource limitation is going to be the factor that determines how effective this is going to be across the border in total, but also in specific areas of the border.
So, Theresa, how would you evaluate the success of the trip? What were the positive outcomes that you observed? I mean, maybe some are still to come, but do you think it was a success so far?
Well, I think it was assessed for a few different reasons. This was obviously the biggest undertaking that the ACE program had been able to do, and we successfully did it. And I think we had good participation from the members. We had good participation from our guests at the meetings. We managed to stay basically on track, and everybody participated. The initial feedback that we got from the offices was fairly positive. So I think just in terms of, carrying out the actual trip, I think it was a success. What we hope is that the members will come back, one, with maybe a better, more nuanced understanding of what's happening at the border, and they can think more directly about things that they might work together on for the border. Although, of course, as we mentioned, it is kind of political, and coming back to DC, they have to fall back into their political camps a little bit. That having been said, speaking with the members in their offices, there may be some smaller things that they could think about working on, and we have some suggestions that we might do there. I think this one trip is going to get a kumbaya from 190 members of Congress or more to be able to pass something. No, I'm not that naive, but it has to start somewhere. And if it starts with a group of 6 members who say, "Hey, we should be able to try to find a way to work together on this," then I think that's important, and that's a step in the right direction.
I think about something that one of our senior fellows here, Bipartisan Policy Center, a former Senator Roy Blunt, has said in the past that when you're looking to work with someone else, work with the other side or on a difficult issue. You don't have to agree on everything, right? You just have to find one thing. And all this is going to be incremental, right? I mean, it's sort of the theory of the case of the entire ACE program is that, you're not going to solve the issues and the dysfunction in Congress overnight, but, someone's going to try. And so, if you are able to identify, as Theresa said, even one or two, smaller things, try to get that done. And then, you build, again, sort of a trust foundation there, and you can move maybe from those one or two onto something else. So, I think, again, certainly with this issue and so many others, nothing's going to be solved overnight, but we're working on it.
Yeah.
And Theresa, what do you have specific next steps that you're looking to take with the members that went on a trip to help deal with the situation at the border?
When we are trying to pull them together for some follow-up meetings and let them talk to each other a little bit more, that's proving challenging just because congressional schedules for members are so difficult. They have so many other commitments, particularly when they're back in DC. And of course, when they're not in DC, they're out. It is election year. They want to be campaigning. But we're trying to see if we can pull them together to have some of those discussions still, off the record. But the other thing I think that's important, and maybe it seems minor, but it's not, is that these members now know each other, right? They have each other's cell phone numbers to chat with. And if they are looking to do something in the border, they know somebody on the other side of the aisle they can at least call up and talk to about it. And that may seem really minor, but you'd be surprised in the House of Representatives, 435 members, just knowing that there's somebody on the other side who could pick up the phone and actually talk to you about it, whether or not you agree to do something together, you are at least talking to each other. And that's a step forward too. And I think that's maybe underappreciated outcome of some of these things.
And not leak those conversations outside of the group.
Right.
We had, it was a totally separate trip from this, but, one of our participants who talked about, one of the values of this is now I have someone on the other side. I can call up with my half-baked idea about X, Y, or Z, what have you, and know that, I'm not going to see it on X, the next day, like, oh, you can't believe this, concept that, so-and-so, this crackpot on the other side came up with. And again, it, sounds like a small thing, but, that's in this environment, that's a major deal.
So, John, I'll give you the last word. Where do you see the ACE program going from here?
Well, first of all, it is the only game in town in terms of running these kind of trips that have, proved very popular and actually more demand than supply and ability to do. And I think it's because it's fulfilling a need for those members of Congress who, are serious about, doing their jobs as legislators. And, I referenced it earlier, but it is true that there are more people in Congress than folks out there would imagine who do want to, are serious about doing their job. And so this is an outlet for them. So we want to continue to be that outlet. As we do that, we want to become even more intentional and more strongly focused on specific issue areas where there is hope for bipartisanship and frankly, where we are doing work here at Bipartisan Policy Center that can dovetail with that. And I think we will probably look at doing more group trips, whether that's 4 or 6. And, we learned it is herding cats, but we're able to do it is the lesson that we derived from it. Just, you got to stay on your toes and roll with the punches as the trip unfolds. But I think it went well, and we're going to look to try to do more of that.
Great. Well, thank you both for taking us through that. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, Theresa will be chatting to one of the members who went on the trip, Representative Nikki Budzinski. So don't go anywhere.
Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Theresa Cardinal Brown, and we are thrilled to have with us Congresswoman Nikki Budzinski. Congresswoman Budzinski is the representative for Illinois' 13th Congressional District that includes Springfield and Champaign-Urbana and the University of Illinois, down to the Missouri border near St. Louis. She was elected in 2023 and is in her freshman term. But before running for Congress, she worked in the labor movement, including stints with the Laborers International Union of North America, otherwise called LIUNA, and the International Association of Firefighters and the United Food and Commercial Workers. She also worked in the administration of Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and spent time as the chief of staff for the Federal Office of Management and Budget in the Biden administration. So welcome to This Week in Immigration, Congresswoman Budzinski.
Thank you so much, Theresa. It's great to be with you.
So we are having you on the podcast to talk a little bit about your trip with us, with the Bipartisan Policy Center's American Congressional Exchange. At the end of April, you and 5 of your colleagues, bipartisan colleagues, joined us on a trip to Arizona to explore all the different perspectives on the border and immigration at the border. So let me start by just asking you, why, when you got the invitation, did you decide to join this ACE trip to the Arizona border?
Well, I really, this was a very unique opportunity, I thought. In particular, I appreciated the chance to go to the border to see firsthand some of the issues that we had certainly been debating and discussing in Congress, but to do it in a bipartisan way. And I think that was personally something that was very important to me. I wanted to be able to basically see the same things at the border with my Republican and Democratic colleagues and then discuss what we saw. And I think that's what this opportunity and this trip presented itself to be, and really was. In a very short amount of time, I think we covered a broad range of different issues that are impacted by what is happening at the border. And so learned a lot, had an opportunity to really have some candid conversations with colleagues on both sides of the aisle on an issue that is really pretty divisive right now politically in our country, and trying to find the middle ground. I am a very firm believer that we do have a broken immigration system. We need to address this system holistically in fixing it, and we have to do it on a bipartisan basis. No one party is going to be able to solve all of these issues. And so that was really, I thought in particular, the unique value of going on this bipartisan trip. And this, of course, back home is an issue that's very top of mind for constituents. So was there to listen and learn.
Yeah. So your district obviously is pretty far away from the border. And yet you're telling me your constituents have concerns about this. So what kind of particular insights, or what were you hoping to learn and or do there before you went on the trip?
Yeah, well, let me just say at home, some of the things that I hear a lot about are, obviously workforce shortages is something that I hear about. I think they're in Illinois, even though my district is 3 hours south of Chicago, Chicago has been taking in a number of thousands of migrants from the border. So that has had a state budget impact. So indirectly, it were directly affecting my district. And I think that, obviously there are also, we want to create more legal pathways to a legal status for those that do want to come into our country. And so from really top to bottom, there are a number of issues that are quite frankly broken. I was looking forward to learning about all of the different components on this trip, and I thought it did a fantastic job, Theresa. First of all, you were a fantastic moderator on the trip.
Why,
it's not easy to be a moderator on these really, again, divisive, complicated issues, but try to kind of extract from us kind of some thoughts and ideas of really where we could find common ground, really where it is, in dealing with our asylum system, securing and providing resources to the border to actually secure the border. We got to see firsthand what was happening at the border, hearing directly from Border Patrol and custom agents on what we were seeing. The importance of, Mexico as a trade partner obviously also is something that we discussed. So learned a lot on a number of different issues, and the issues that I hear really top of mind for constituents back home as it relates to immigration.
Yeah. So you've probably been on other congressional delegations and visit. What do you think made this trip different from some of those other ones that you've been on?
Well, I would just say, and as a freshman, I haven't been on a ton of trips, to be honest. But this really was my first truly bipartisan member trip. And so I think the value and really what was unique and special about this is that she gave us all space under Chatham House rules to kind of be open and discuss our thoughts. We met with some very conservative sheriffs that are trying to deal with the crisis at the border. Hearing directly from them was very, I think, important. But also at the same time, we met with Casa Elitas to learn about the important work that nonprofits are doing. And I think all of us coming at the issue of addressing our broken immigration system are coming at it with different perspectives and ideas. And I think being able to kind of uniquely stitch those together for a conversation was what you were able to do. And I think that in and of itself is unique in Washington in general.
Yeah. So thinking back on it, what did you find most informative about this trip?
So, what I found to be really one of the more informative parts of the trip was in learning about the asylum system and really the differences between administrations in dealing with asylees, and how we can be looking at different policy prescriptions for how to deal with asylum. That is certainly one aspect of, I think, what is a broader broken immigration system itself. But because that really is something that's very top of mind, I think obviously I believe it is exacerbating some of the migrant movement into the United States. What do we need to do to more fully address it? And also appreciating, we discussed this, our immigration system hasn't been truly reformed in decades. And so when you think about how much our economy, our communities have changed over the last 30 years, we are still living under an immigration system that has not changed with those times. And so a lot of these pain points, whether it's with our asylum system, whether it's with the use of technology at the border. I mean, one of the things I found to be so interesting, and a lot of the conversation has been around building a wall, but actually hearing from custom agents the importance of technology at the border and how they use that as a tool rather than an actual physical barrier. That is obviously one important part of the border, but it isn't the end all be all. We need to be arming our Border Patrol agents with technology, whether it's drones or we talked about heat censored maps that, help to, notify Border Patrol agents of where migrants might be crossing. That was fascinating to really learn about the importance. I think third, I would say, Theresa, something that's very top of mind at home is fentanyl. And Arizona's border in particular, learning that is a state in particular is a lot of the fentanyl is coming across at those ports of entry, learning firsthand kind of how they might be getting in, the importance of our ports of entry and fully staffing those to stop that flow. That is something that I can tell you is very top of mind for my constituents. And so that too is something very interesting to learn about.
Was there anything that stood out as a big sort of aha moment, something that you really had no idea about before and went, oh, wow, okay.
What I would say is the influence of the cartels. I did not understand how large of a role, how big business it is for the cartels at the border, and really the importance of the United States and Mexico's relationship in how we can crack down. In particular, obviously, that's on Mexico to make sure they have law and order. But I think in order to fully address the influence of the cartels at the border, that would have to be a partnership with the United States and Mexico. But to learn that, for safe passage for a migrant that's looking to cross our border right now, they can pay upwards of $10,000 a person to be smuggled into the United States using the cartel system. That is big business for these guys. And what are we doing to crack down on that? I found that very eye-opening.
Yeah. So you had a chance to, work with the other members who were on the trip. How did you get along with them? And did you find the fact that you were with maybe members you hadn't worked with before, was that helpful to you?
Yeah, I thought it was very, it's always great to meet members off campus, so to speak. So, not on the Capitol grounds. It was really nice to be with Congressman Siscomani and Congressman Stanton. Those were their home areas, obviously, very familiar with the communities we were visiting to kind of see them in their districts. I think we spent a lot of our time in Congressman Siscomani's district in particular. But it was a great opportunity to just kind of break bread with members and begin a relationship. And I do think that back home, people really desperately want to believe that we can still find the ability to come together, share a meal, talk about the places where we agree and disagree, and try to do what's right for our communities and for the American people. And I think that's what's so great about a trip like this, is it gives us that space to do that. I've, continued to keep a friendly relationship with both the Democrats and Republicans that were on this trip, and I hope we'll continue to stay together just as we continue to discuss, addressing our problems with immigration.
Yeah. What do you think was your favorite part of the trip?
I would honestly credit Casa Alitas. I was very moved by I referred to it when I talked about it back home as kind of the Lord's work. They are really doing the work of making sure that migrants have access at least to the ability to know how to navigate the system, what's next for them. Really were a lifeline. I met a Ukrainian, there was a Ukrainian, I don't know if you remember this, a Ukrainian
Yeah.
Immigrant that was actually working then now at Casa Alitas, helping people that had arrived at Casa Alitas navigate our immigration system. And I just, I found that very poignant.
So, what were your sort of key takeaways, and how do you think it might shape your legislative thinking on these issues moving forward?
I really believe that we do have a crisis at the border. The border, though, to me, is a very big symptom of the larger problem. And in order to really address all of the different components, whether it's stopping fentanyl from getting into our border, creating a legal pathway to those that want to enter our country, a process that really works, that doesn't take decades, and those that are truly seeking asylum as well, to be able to seek that asylum in an orderly and fair process. I think that in order to tackle immigration, we have to all collectively realize that it isn't just the border that needs to be addressed, that we have to look at the fact that we have dreamers in this country. This is the only country these people, once young, probably now not so young, have ever known. Some of them have fought in our military. Or been in our military and fought our wars. We have to be able to create a real process that is functional and reflects the technologies of today. There's been a lot of discussion around the fact that a lot of people, in order to start their process of immigration, have to be at the border. Technology should allow folks that want to come into our country to begin their process where they are. I think finding more common sense, orderly new ideas and leaning on technology to help address some of those opportunities could help us address some of these pressures. But I really very much believe we have to address immigration reform holistically in a big picture way and not piecemeal. I'm a little fearful that some of the work we're doing now, which is important to securing our border, and we have to do that, is not going to fully alleviate all of the pressure points that exacerbate the issues at the border, which is creating a more orderly process for legal status to our country for those that we, can allow in, and what that looks like.
So, the last question is, colleagues of yours who haven't yet been on an ACE trip or gone to the border, would you recommend a similar trip to them in the future?
Absolutely. I'm a member of the New Dem Coalition, and Congressman Stanton was our task force leader on immigration. And so he and I have certainly been advocating for our fellow New Dem members to go on this border trip. Anyone that would be, talk to me about it, I would definitely encourage them to do it. It's a unique opportunity. A lot of members do host some other great trips, but I think the uniqueness, again, of the Bipartisan Policy Center's trip was that it was, in fact, bipartisan. I think we can each learn from each other.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Congresswoman Budzinski, for joining us on the podcast. Thank you for joining us on the border trip. I know you've got to go vote, but we really appreciate your time on This Week in Immigration.
Thank you, Theresa.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find our podcast episodes on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown, and you can follow me at Jack Malde. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malde. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself, Rennie Mockery, and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.